I raised my daughter alone. At her wedding, her father-in-law humiliated me in front of 400 guests until I stood up and said, "Do you even know who I am?" His smile vanished instantly. 2 officers came to the door on a Tuesday morning in March, and I knew before either of them said a word. I knew from the way they stood with their hats already off, from the careful distance between them, from the chaplain half a step behind the taller one. My daughter was asleep down the hall, not quite 2, and I remember standing in the doorway with my hand still on the frame, thinking with strange, detached clarity that I needed to be quiet so I wouldn't wake her before I understood what I was about to become. He was a Green Beret, an engineer attached to a team doing work I was never given the full shape of. The official language was economical to the point of cruelty. Killed in action, improvised explosive device. A province I had to look up on a map because I had never heard its name before and never wanted to hear it again. They handed me a flag folded into a tight triangle, and a few weeks later, a woman from the family assistance office called to walk me through what came next. She was kind in a way that felt almost unbearable in those first months, when kindness was the thing most likely to make me fall apart in a parking lot. She helped me file the paperwork. She explained the survivor benefits, the small monthly amount that would arrive on the 3rd of every month for the rest of my life, an amount that sounded like a great deal of money to a 24-year-old holding a folded flag, and turned out, within a year, to be barely enough for rent. There was one other thing she mentioned, almost in passing. My husband had listed a provision in his paperwork, something separate from the standard benefits, tied to an investment he'd made with a fellow soldier before his final deployment. She didn't have details. She gave me a name and a phone number on a sticky note and told me I could look into it whenever I was ready, that grief had its own timeline and money could wait. I didn't call the number for 8 months. By then, I had moved us into a 2-bedroom apartment above a hardware store, and I had started work as a nurse's aide at a facility 20 minutes away, the kind of job that pays just enough to make you ineligible for the help that would have made the difference, and not enough to actually live on. I worked the early shift, 6 to 2, and most nights after my daughter was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the electric bill, the water bill, and the sticky note, gone soft and translucent at the folds, telling myself I would call tomorrow. When I finally did call, a man answered on the second ring. He introduced himself as a friend of my husband's, someone who had served 2 tours alongside him before a knee injury sent him home early, and he spoke about my husband in the specific way people speak about someone they actually knew. He told me that before his final deployment, my husband had used a small inheritance from his grandfather, along with part of a re-enlistment bonus, to help this friend start a machine shop, Precision Parts. Small commercial contracts at first, brackets and housings for companies that made things nobody thinks about until they fail. He believed in it before I did, the man told me. He used to say the country would always need people who could make small things exactly right. He wasn't wrong. The investment had been modest, structured as a minority stake with dividend provisions, the kind of thing that in most versions of this story would have amounted to nothing. But the shop grew. Government contracts began to trickle in, then more than trickle. The friend offered more than once to buy out my husband's stake, to make things simpler. I told him no every time, not out of any financial instinct, but because it was the last thing my husband had believed in before he died, so the stake stayed. A local attorney, a man who had also served, agreed to manage it in trust for my daughter, checking in twice a year with a letter I mostly skimmed and filed in a drawer I rarely opened. I was not thinking about equity or dividend structures. I was thinking about whether I had enough in checking to cover daycare and groceries in the same week, whether the car would make it through another winter, whether my daughter's shoes still fit. She never knew about any of it. What she knew was a small apartment that smelled faintly of hardware store sawdust, a mother who worked mornings and came home tired, and a father she had never met except through photographs and the stories I told her at bedtime, carefully edited down to the parts that felt safe for a child to carry. For 18 years, I wore the same gray cardigan to every school function, mended twice at the elbow. People at those nights assumed I cleaned houses for a living. I never corrected them. There didn't seem to be a version of the truth that would have made anything easier, and there was a part of me that had simply stopped believing the truth mattered at all. That money you didn't spend and didn't quite believe was real might as well not exist. The years did not pass so much as accumulate, the way sediment does, one thin layer at a time until you look up and there's a canyon behind you. There was the year the car's transmission went and I walked to work for 4 months. There was the year my daughter had a fever that wouldn't break and I sat in an emergency room until 3 in the morning doing math in my head about whether it would be the copay or the missed shift the next morning that hurt worse than feeling sick with myself for doing that math at all while she lay flushed and small in my lap. There was also, in smaller and more frequent measure, the good. My daughter learning to read early, sounding out cereal boxes at the kitchen table. My daughter, at 6, giving her only stuffed rabbit to a girl at daycare whose family had just lost their apartment in a fire, without being asked, simply walking over and setting it in the other girl's lap and going back to her coloring like it was nothing. I remember watching that from the doorway and having to turn around so she wouldn't see me cry. She grew up quiet and watchful in a way I sometimes worried about and later came to understand as its own kind of strength. She noticed things, that other kids' mothers picked them up in newer cars, that other kids brought lunches with things in them we couldn't afford, that other kids talked about vacations in a way that assumed everyone had them. She never once asked me for anything beyond what I offered. I think she had simply decided very early that wanting things she couldn't have wasn't going to be a productive use of her energy, and redirected all of it instead into being genuinely, unperformed, decent to the people around her. I called the attorney twice a year, as arranged, though for most of those years, the calls were brief and administrative. The shop had been acquired by a larger regional manufacturer when my daughter was around 7, converting the original minority stake into shares of the new, larger company, still managed in trust, still untouched. I remember telling him, honestly, that I trusted him to do what my husband would have wanted, and that I didn't have the bandwidth that year to learn about shareholder structures, not with a 7-year-old and a water heater that had just failed. That's all right, he told me. That's what I'm here for. You just keep doing what you're doing. What I was doing most days was getting up before 5 to start the coffee, working a 6 to 2 shift, changing bed sheets, and helping elderly patients who often couldn't remember my name from one day to the next, coming home to help with homework, and then sitting at the kitchen table after she was asleep doing the actual arithmetic of survival. I was not managing a growing equity position in a defense-adjacent manufacturing company. I was managing a life with exactly enough room in it for one child, and the drawer with the attorney's letters sat mostly closed, a fact about my life so separate from my daily experience of it that it barely registered as true. By the time my daughter was in high school, the acquired company had itself become a subsidiary of a larger parts supplier, serving contracts up and down the coast, defense-adjacent, aerospace-adjacent, the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps running regardless of what the broader economy is doing. The trust position had grown alongside it, steadily, the way anything grows when left alone in fertile ground for a decade and a half. I was not secretly wealthy and quietly pretending otherwise. I genuinely did not think in terms of net worth. I thought in terms of whether the rent check would clear before the electric bill did, whether the water heater had another winter left in it. She got a partial scholarship to a state university 2 hours away, the kind that covers tuition but leaves a family to figure out the rest, and for the first time I called the attorney with a specific request rather than waiting for his biannual check-in. I asked him what could be released to cover the difference. He told me gently that the position could cover considerably more than the difference, that I could cover the whole thing outright without meaningfully touching the principal. I remember sitting very still at the kitchen table, not quite able to make the two facts fit together in my head: the woman who clipped coupons and a number large enough to make a tuition gap look small. I let him cover the gap and did not ask him to explain further. My daughter never knew any of this. What she knew was that her scholarship had worked out, that her mother had found a way, the way I always seem to find a way, and she hugged me in the kitchen and cried a little, and I let her believe it was the same kind of finding a way it had always been, because that was easier than trying to explain something I barely understood myself. It was 2 years later, home for a summer between semesters, that she met the man who would become her husband. She met him at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning when she'd come home to help me with a garden bed I'd been meaning to build for years. He was there buying tomatoes for his mother, he told her later, which struck both of us as almost aggressively wholesome for a man whose family, it turned out, owned roughly half the industrial park on the east side of the city. He didn't look like money. That was the first thing my daughter said about him when she came home, flushed and smiling, and told me she'd given her number to a stranger over a crate of heirloom tomatoes. He wore a shirt with a hole starting at the collar and drove a truck older than the one I'd finally traded in the year before. It took her 3 dates to learn his last name was attached to buildings she'd driven past her whole life without ever connecting them to a person. And when she told me, sitting on the edge of my bed the way she used to as a teenager, working up to a confession, she looked almost embarrassed by it, like the money was something he'd done to her. He's not like that, she said, meaning that he wasn't like what she assumed people with money were like, itself a small window into 18 years spent watching other families' comfort from just outside it. He helped an old man carry his groceries to his car before he even knew I was watching. He didn't do it for me. He just did it. I liked him before I met him, and I liked him more once I did. He came to dinner at our apartment and complimented the meal in a way that didn't feel like a performance, and he noticed the mended cardigan hanging by the door and said nothing about it, which felt like its own small kindness. He helped clear the table without being asked. He asked my daughter about her classes and actually listened to the answers. His mother, when we finally met her, was warm in an uncomplicated way that made me want to like his father by extension. She hugged me at the door of a restaurant I could not have afforded on my own, and talked easily about her garden and her book club, asking genuine questions about my work and my daughter's childhood. His father arrived 15 minutes late and shook my hand the way you shake hands with someone you've already decided isn't worth the full attention of your grip. I want to be fair to that first impression. He was not unkind that evening. He was simply elsewhere. His eyes moved past me toward the door twice while I was mid-sentence. He asked me one question the entire dinner: what did I do for work? And when I told him I worked at a care facility, he said, "How noble," in a tone that made noble sound like a word for people who had failed to arrange their lives more profitably, then turned to his son and began a story about a golf outing that lasted 20 minutes. I told myself it didn't matter. My daughter was happy. His mother was kind. His father's attention was not something I needed at 51 years old with a job I liked well enough and a daughter who had turned out, against considerable odds, exactly the way I'd hoped she would. But the small moments accumulated, one thin layer at a time. At the engagement dinner, 8 months later, he looked at me exactly once. Really looked the way you look at someone deciding what category to file them under. And then he looked through me for the rest of the evening, the way you look through a waiter you've already tipped. He made a comment about my car, parked in the restaurant's valet line because I hadn't understood there was a self-park option that would have saved $12. That must have been a journey, he said when the valet handed him a ticket for a car worth 4 years of my salary and walked past mine, 10 years old, with a crack in the windshield I kept meaning to fix. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the valet, laughing, in the specific way men like him laugh when they've said something they consider clever. My daughter's face went tight in a way I recognized from 18 years of watching her absorb small unfairnesses without complaint. His son, my future son-in-law, though I hadn't started thinking of him that way yet, put his hand on her back and steered the conversation somewhere else, quickly, the way you'd redirect a car that had started to drift. I said nothing. I had spent most of my adult life being underestimated by people who assumed a modest coat and a modest car told the whole story, and I had gotten practiced at letting it pass. I went home that night and did not think about the comment again for several weeks. The wedding planning began not long after, and that was when my daughter, for the first time, started asking questions I didn't quite know how to answer. The venue she wanted, modest by his family's standards, extravagant by mine, required a deposit that made my stomach drop when she showed me the number, apologetically, already halfway to suggesting somewhere cheaper. I told her not to worry about it. I told her I'd take care of it, the way I'd always told her that, the way it had always, eventually, turned out to be true through some combination of overtime and careful math, and things I quietly went without. This time, though, I called the attorney first. He'd become, over the years, something closer to a family friend than a financial administrator, a dry, kind man in his 60s now who still called me twice a year even when there was nothing urgent to report. When I told him what the deposit was, then the full venue cost, then haltingly, whether we could manage it, he was quiet for a moment. You could manage considerably more than that without touching the principal, he said. You know that. I did know that in the abstract way I'd known it since the tuition conversation years earlier. It became real a little when he sent the funds and I watched the venue balance clear in a single transfer instead of the installment payments I'd half expected to negotiate. My daughter noticed. Of course she noticed. She had spent her whole life reading the exact texture of our finances, and a wedding deposit clearing without visible strain was not a texture she recognized. She cornered me in my kitchen on a Tuesday evening, sitting across the table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, and asked me directly, "Mom, how are we affording this? The venue, the dress, all of it. I did the math. It doesn't add up to what you make." I had rehearsed a version of this conversation for years. In the vague way you rehearse conversations you assume you'll never actually have to have, and none of the rehearsed versions felt right in the moment. I told her the truth, or a careful, incomplete shape of it. "There's a trust," I said, "from your father. Before he died, he made an investment with a friend of his, someone he served with. It grew over the years. I've never touched it, except for things like this, your college, and now this." She was quiet for a long moment, turning her teacup in slow circles. "How much is it?" she finally asked. "Enough," I said. "Enough that you don't need to worry about the venue, or the dress, or any of it. Your father made sure of that, a long time before either of us knew we'd need it." I did not tell her the specific number because I did not fully know it myself, not with any precision. I did not tell her about the machine shop, or the acquisition, or the larger art supplier it had folded into. I told her there was a trust, that it came from her father, that it was enough, and I watched something in her face soften and unknot in a way I hadn't realized had been knotted at all until I saw it release. She cried a little, the way she used to as a child when relief arrived after something she'd been carrying alone. "I always wondered," she said, "how you did it all those years. I used to think you were just, I don't know, magic, or exhausted in a way you never let me see." "Both, probably," I said, and she laughed wetly and reached across the table to hold my hand, and for a moment the whole conversation felt like an ending, a door that had been slightly ajar for 18 years finally clicking shut. I let her believe that was the whole shape of it, a trust from her father, enough for a wedding and a college gap, and not much more discussion needed. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was simply not the entire truth, and there is a difference, even if the difference is a narrow one. I have thought about that conversation many times since. I could have told her more, the actual number, the actual nature of the company the trust now held a controlling interest in. Part of it was that I genuinely didn't understand the full shape myself, not with any confidence. But part of it, the more honest part, was that the number felt like it belonged to a version of our life we hadn't lived, and I wasn't ready to let that version overwrite the one we'd actually had. His father, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation. I learned about it secondhand from my daughter, who'd overheard her fiancé and his father in a study during a family gathering I hadn't been invited to. His father had apparently hired a private researcher to look into me before the wedding, a due diligence pass on the woman his son was about to formally welcome into the family. "Nurse's aide," my daughter reported, her voice tight with secondhand humiliation on my behalf. "Widow's benefits, a government housing voucher apparently for 2 years when I was little, which I never even knew about. That's what he told his son. That's what you're marrying into." I had, in fact, used a housing voucher for 2 years, before my income crossed a threshold that made us ineligible. What struck me, hearing my daughter's account, was not the fact itself, but the completeness with which it had apparently satisfied him. A paid researcher had looked into 2 decades of my financial life and come back with exactly the surface it was designed to show. Nothing about a trust held under an attorney's name rather than my own, structured, deliberately or not, in a way that kept it invisible to anyone looking for my name on a filing. I didn't know then that this particular blind spot would matter later. I only knew that a man had paid someone to confirm what he'd already decided about me, and that the confirmation had made him more comfortable in his contempt rather than less. "I'm sorry," my daughter said. "I shouldn't have told you. I was so angry. He doesn't know anything about you. Not really. It's all right," I told her. "People believe what's easiest for them to believe. It usually says more about them than it does about you or me." She hugged me before she left that night, longer than usual, and I stood in the doorway thinking that there was a version of this story where I called the attorney and asked him to draft something formal, something that would would put a stop to the comments before the wedding ever arrived. I decided against it, partly because I didn't want the wedding to become a legal skirmish before it had even happened, but partly, I'll admit now, because some quiet portion of me wanted him to keep believing what he believed right up until the moment he couldn't anymore. The months between the engagement dinner and the wedding itself were not, contrary to what a simpler version of this story might suggest, a steady escalation of open hostility. Most of them were ordinary: tasting appointments, fittings, the particular tedium of finalizing a seating chart for 400 people, half of whom I'd never met. My daughter was happy, mostly in the specific, slightly harried way brides are happy in the last stretch before a wedding. He surfaced periodically, the way a splinter surfaces, not constantly painful, but present, and impossible to fully ignore once you know it's there. There was the rehearsal dinner planning call, where he suggested, in a tone that framed it as generosity, that his family would be happy to cover the entire rehearsal dinner, so there's no need for anyone to feel out of their depth. My daughter, mortified, tried to redirect the conversation. I let it pass. I had learned over 18 years which battles were worth the energy they cost. There was the moment, at a cake tasting, when he asked me whether I'd need help arranging transportation to the venue, since it was quite a drive from that side of town, a comment that managed to be both geographically incorrect and unmistakably about something other than geography. I told him I had a car and knew how to drive it. He laughed, the golf outing laugh, and moved on to ask the baker about fondant. There was the guest list conversation, conducted almost entirely without me, where I later learned he had lobbied, unsuccessfully, to cap the number of guests from my side, on the logic that these things tend to get out of hand when people who aren't used to events like this start inviting everyone they've ever met. I had, in fact, invited a modest handful of people: 2 co-workers from the care facility, a cousin I saw twice a year, and the attorney whom I'd started thinking of, by then, less as an administrator and more as the closest thing to family my husband's absence had left me. I called to invite him personally, rather than mailing an invitation the way I had for everyone else. "I'd like you there," I told him over the phone, at the same kitchen table where I'd once done bill math and later told my daughter a careful, incomplete version of the truth. Not as the attorney, as family, I suppose, at this point. "You've been part of this longer than almost anyone." There was a pause on the line, and when he spoke, his voice had gone slightly rough. "I'd be honored," he said. "Truly." I hesitated. Then, before adding the part I'd been turning over for weeks, "Would you mind," I said, "bringing the file, the current one, just in case?" I didn't specify in case of what, and he didn't ask me to. There are people who know you well enough that a request like that doesn't require an explanation. "I'll have it with me," he said simply. I did not, at that point, have a clear plan. I was not orchestrating a confrontation, not consciously. I told myself I simply wanted the option available, the way you might carry an umbrella on a day that's only slightly cloudy. I had absorbed 18 years of small comments and one very thorough researcher's report, and something in me, some quiet, patient heart, had decided it wanted the option to answer, cleanly and completely, if the moment ever called for it. I did not tell my daughter I'd made that call, or what I'd asked him to bring. Some part of me wanted to hold the option privately, the way I'd held the drawer of letters privately for 18 years, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but because some things feel more like yours if you carry them alone for a while, before anyone else knows they exist. 2 weeks before the wedding, at the final dress fitting, my daughter's future father-in-law made his last significant appearance before the day itself, and it was the clearest window into him I'd gotten in the entire engagement. He'd come, he said, to see the dress before the big reveal, though I suspected, watching him take in the modest boutique with its slightly worn carpet, that he'd actually come to confirm some final data point about the family his son was marrying into. He complimented the dress briefly, then found a moment, while she was back in the fitting room, to speak to me alone. "I want you to know," he said, in a tone that managed to sound almost kind, which was somehow worse than open contempt would have been, "that I don't hold any of this against you personally. The circumstances. It's not your fault, the hand you were dealt. I simply think it's important that we're all clear-eyed about where things stand. My son is marrying into a certain kind of life now. I'd hate for anyone to feel out of place at their own daughter's wedding." I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, long enough that he seemed to register he might have misjudged how the comment would land. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "I've never once felt out of place in my own life. I don't expect that to start at my daughter's wedding." He smiled the way he always smiled, indulgent, already moving past the exchange, and left before my daughter emerged from the fitting room in a dress that made her look, briefly and completely, like the only thing in the room worth looking at. I never told her about that conversation either. Some things I'd decided by then were mine to carry until the moment they weren't. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and clear, the specific kind of early autumn morning that photographs beautifully and requires a coat you don't quite need by noon. I woke before my alarm and lay in bed for a few minutes doing the strange arithmetic of the day ahead: hair appointment at 8, photos at 11, ceremony at 2, before getting up to make coffee in the quiet apartment I'd lived in alone since my daughter had moved out for good. I wore a dress I'd bought new for the occasion, a soft blue gray I'd chosen mostly because it didn't require me to think too hard about it. I did not wear the cardigan. I thought about it, standing in front of my closet, the old gray cardigan still hanging where it always hung, and some part of me considered bringing it anyway, folded into my bag in case the hall ran cold. I left it at home. It felt that morning like a piece of a chapter that had already closed, even though I hadn't yet lived the day that would actually close it. The attorney texted me at 9, a single line, "On my way, brought everything," and I remember reading it twice, feeling something settle in my chest that was not quite anxiety and not quite great anticipation, the particular stillness of a person who has quietly prepared for a possibility she hopes she won't need. I saw my daughter before the ceremony in the small anteroom the venue had set aside for the bridal party, and the sight of her fully assembled now, wearing my earrings from my own wedding 28 years earlier, undid something in me that I'd been holding carefully in place all morning. I cried and she cried, and her makeup artist handed us both tissues without breaking stride. "I wish he could see this," my daughter said, meaning her father, and I said, "He does," with more certainty than I actually possessed, because it was the kind of thing a mother says on a wedding morning, and because I wanted it to be true badly enough that the wanting felt close enough to believe. Her father-in-law found me briefly before the ceremony, dressed in a suit tailored specifically for the occasion. He was, in that brief exchange, almost warm, the particular warmth of a man on the day of an event he considers finally, mercifully concluding. "Big day," he said, which was not a question, and moved on down the hallway to find his wife. I stood there a moment, thinking about the researcher's report, the housing voucher, the comment about transportation, and the drawer of letters 2 miles away, feeling something that was not quite anger and not quite satisfaction, waiting to see which direction the day would push it. The ceremony itself was beautiful. In the straightforward way ceremonies are beautiful when the two people at the center of them are genuinely happy to be there. My daughter walked down an aisle lined with white chairs and late-blooming flowers, and her soon-to-be husband cried openly when he saw her. I sat in the front row between the attorney, a slim leather folder resting on his lap, and an empty seat I had, without quite deciding to, left for the possibility of a husband who wasn't there and never would be again. When they were pronounced married, the whole room stood and applauded, and for a few minutes, walking out into the golden afternoon light, I let myself believe that the hard part might simply be over now. The reception began an hour later, in a hall with ceilings I genuinely could not stop staring at, string lights threaded through exposed beams. I found my assigned seat, close enough to the head table to see everything clearly, and the attorney took the seat beside me, the folder resting, closed, on the table between his water glass and his bread plate. For most of the first hour, nothing about the evening suggested it would become anything other than the kind of joyful reception that gets remembered fondly and never mentioned again in any specific detail. Then, between the second and third courses, her father-in-law stood, tapped his glass with a spoon, and asked for the microphone. He smiled at the room the way men like him always smile, like he already knows the joke is going to land, and 400 faces turned toward him with the practiced attention of people who have sat through enough wedding toasts to recognize the shape of one beginning. "I want to say a word about the mother of the bride," he began, and I felt the attorney go very slightly still beside me. Raising a daughter alone isn't easy, and she did it, from what I understand, on very little. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room, the kind engineered by tone rather than content. "And somehow she's landed her here, somewhere so much bigger than either of them were really built for." He lifted his glass. "To exceeding expectations." The laughter that followed was thin and knowing, and it landed worse than open cruelty would have, because open cruelty at least has the decency to be honest about what it is. My daughter's face, 3 tables away, went the exact color of the tablecloth beneath her untouched wine glass. Her new husband stood halfway out of his chair, and his father's hand came down on his shoulder. He sat back down, jaw tight, saying nothing. I stood up. My chair scraped the floor loudly enough that the string quartet, mid-phrase, actually stopped playing. I felt, more than saw, the attorney's hand move toward the folder on the table, not opening it, not yet, just resting his palm flat against the leather. I walked to the front of the room, and for the length of that walk, the room went almost entirely silent. 400 people watching a mother of the bride walk toward a microphone with no clear indication of what she intended to do with it produces a very specific kind of quiet. The quiet of an audience that has sensed a plot turn before the actors have delivered the line that confirms it. For about 10 seconds, standing in front of him with the microphone not yet in my hand, it looked like nothing was going to happen at all. For those 10 seconds, it looked like I was simply going to stand there with a wounded expression, and he was going to stand there with his glass still raised, waiting to see whether I would cry, apologize, or simply walk back to my seat. I could see him calculating which of those outcomes was most likely, settling, I think, on some version of all three. He held the microphone out to me, magnanimous, already composing whatever gracious thing he intended to say once I'd had my moment. "You're right that I raised her on very little," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, steady enough that I heard it land in the far corners of the room. "My husband died protecting people he never met halfway around the world, doing work I still don't fully understand the details of 2 decades later. The government sent me a folded flag and a check that didn't cover his funeral, let alone a childhood. I worked mornings at a care facility for 18 years. I wore the same coat to every school function my daughter ever had, mended twice at the elbow because that coat still worked. I'm not ashamed of a single day of any of that." He nodded along as I spoke, the particular nod of a man who believes he is being flattered rather than confronted, already reaching to reclaim the microphone. "That's a lovely sentiment," he said, and I watched, in real time, the specific shape of the evening he expected, a dignified little speech about hardship, absorbed graciously, filed away as evidence of his own generosity in tolerating a woman like me at his son's wedding. If the evening had gone the way he expected, it would have ended right there. That was, I understood later, the version of this story he had already written in his head. A brief, sympathetic interruption, contained and concluded within 30 seconds, changing nothing about the fundamental arrangement of who mattered in that room. "Do you even know who I am?" I asked before he could take the microphone back. He paused, glass still half raised, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite confusion confusion, and wasn't quite amusement. Some third expression reserved for questions he considered beneath needing a real answer. "You're the bride's mother," he said, in the exact tone he might have used to confirm the time to someone who'd asked twice. I looked past him for just a moment to the table where the attorney sat with the folder now open on his lap, watching me with the stillness of a man who has spent 2 decades waiting to see whether this specific day would ever arrive. And then I looked back at the man standing in front of 400 silent guests, still holding his glass, still smiling the smile of someone who has not yet understood that the ground beneath him has already started to shift. So I'm also the majority trustee of the company that's been supplying 60% of your firm's parts contracts for the last 11 years, I said. I watched the sentence land, or try to. I watched him search for the version of this that made sense to him. A mistake, an exaggeration, some misunderstanding he could correct the way he'd corrected me about parking and transportation across 2 years of dinners. His business, the one with his family's name on the building, depended for the majority of its parts contracts on exactly one primary supplier. He knew that number precisely, the way men like him always know the load-bearing numbers of their own businesses, even when they've stopped examining where those numbers ultimately trace back to. His smile didn't move yet. I don't think, in that first moment, he had fully connected the sentence I'd just said to the specific supplier he depended on, the way it takes a beat for a body to register an injury before the pain actually arrives. That's when the man 3 tables back rose from his seat. I'd introduced him to my daughter, months earlier, simply as an old family friend, someone who'd known her father. That introduction had been true, as far as it went, in the same careful, incomplete way the kitchen table conversation about the trust had been true. He was, in fact, the attorney who had managed that trust since before my daughter could walk, who had sat quietly through an entire reception with a folder on his lap that he had, until this exact moment, made no effort to open. He walked to the front without hurrying, stood beside me, and opened the folder. "Ma'am," he said, though the words were unmistakably for the room, "would you like me to confirm the filing?" "Please," I said. He read the entity name aloud, the parent company, the one that had absorbed a small machine shop and then several companies like it over 2 decades of unglamorous consolidation, and the ownership percentage, stated plainly, a number large enough that I heard it produce an audible sound from the first several tables. He read the date the trust had been established, 11 years before this wedding, almost to the month, a date that predated, by more than a decade, the first golf outing story I'd ever had to sit through at that man's dinner table. He read the trustee of record, my name, stated formally, the way it appeared on a legal filing rather than the way it had appeared for 2 years, on a place card at increasingly humiliating family dinners. I watched her father-in-law's face while the attorney read. It was not sudden exactly. It moved through him the way cold water moves through a body on first contact, a full-body recognition that arrives everywhere at once but takes a visible moment to reach the surface. His jaw, which had held its confident, faintly amused set through the entire toast, went slack by fractions. The color that left his face didn't drain so much as simply stop being replenished, the way a room goes dim when a bulb finally fails rather than when someone flips a switch. The smile vanished, not all at once. It receded, the way tide recedes, visible and complete and impossible to reverse once it's begun. 400 guests sat in a silence so total I could hear ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables back. His wife had gone very still, her hand halfway to her water glass and frozen there. His son looked at his father, then at me, something in his expression cracking open with an understanding I could see him working, visibly, to reassemble into some version of the father he'd grown up believing he had. My daughter, at the head table, had both hands pressed flat against her mouth, and above them her eyes were doing something I recognized immediately, because I had done the exact same thing across a kitchen table 8 months earlier, turning cold tea in slow circles, learning that the shape of her life had always been slightly larger than the version she'd been given. I didn't say anything further. I had turned this moment over in my head more times than I could count, and in most of those imagined versions I said something sharper, some final line calibrated to land exactly as hard as 18 years of small comments deserved. Standing there with 400 people holding a silence I could have filled with almost anything, I found I didn't want to fill it with anything at all. I set the microphone down on the table in front of him, gently, the way you set something down when you no longer have any use for it. The room didn't laugh that time.